Welcome to Sensing the Signal. I'm Terry Patar from Atreides. We're exploring the overlap between data, technology and intelligence in our increasingly volatile and complex world, what this means for national security, and how deeper insight can help organisations make better decisions. I've spent the past 20 years helping organisations improve their intelligence capabilities. I'm fascinated by how we understand the world around us. Now I get to talk to some of the leading voices who I've learned from myself. On this episode, I'm joined by Matt Lane, founder of 325X, a venture studio specialising in defence tech and cyber. We talked about the recent Strategic Defence Review in the UK and a lot of the points that come out of that, what it means not just for defence in government, but also what it means for defence industry, technology companies, and what it means for the wider population and the whole country. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Terry. Pleasure to be involved.
Well, it's good to talk to you. Matt, give us a bit of an introduction to yourself that explains a bit more about what you're involved in and what you're kind of, because you've got quite a unique position, I think, and it's quite interesting, I think, for people to hear about that.
Yeah, I suppose in a slightly odd way, I've lived a few different lives already, which is a terribly odd thing to say. But my background, really, my professional background, I grew up in government service as an intelligence analyst. It's quite the environment to grow up into. Specialise in cyber operations, counter-terrorism, as you know. And then suddenly you look outside at the real world and go, well, how does any of that work? So off I went with a few colleagues and co-founded our own OSINT business, open source intelligence business, which I know you're very familiar with and how we met, of course. And since then, myself and some other partners have founded 325X. It's a venture studio. And what that means is it does more than just provide access to capital. It also provides some of the resources and friendly support that companies, particularly innovative companies, need in this space. It is very, very hard to build your own business, and anyone perhaps listening who's gone through that process will sympathise immediately. But we've tried to produce something that we think will help people in a way that we wish we'd have had access to the same sort of help when we were doing it for the first time.
That is, as I said, really interesting, because you're not just placing money somewhere and hoping to make a profit. You're actively helping develop, I suppose, interesting and exciting capabilities in many ways.
Yeah, exactly right.
Defense,
so, I mean, we help people. What we don't do is help people with their ideas. They have their own ideas. But what we can do is get on board and effectively join the team as a co-founder and bring some of that experience in, perhaps you might argue, the slightly more boring areas, but areas where we don't mind getting ourselves involved. So business plans, commercial reality, potentially relevant to today's conversation, was the commercial realities of trying to sell innovative technologies into defence. So with that in mind, for example, we focus specifically on dual use technologies, a somewhat overused term. I'm sure you've heard it. I'm sure other people have heard it. But for us, dual use, we mean it in its original intention, which is something that has a specific commercial application. And for us, we look at things that are relevant to things like critical national infrastructure protection. That also has a relevance to defence, national security or law enforcement. Rarely the other way around. It's quite difficult, for example, to say, our missile technology is a dual use because we can get involved in demolition. But these things do happen.
Yeah.
There are areas of crossover. But this is proper dual use, not sort of use the word dual use in order to try and fill some tick box
to get investment
in the first place.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's super relevant, as you said, to today's conversation, because I'm always excited to talk to you, but particularly so now because we've just had the SDR, Strategic Defence Review, that's come out recently. You are probably the only person I know who's read the entire thing.
Sorry about that. I didn't have anything else to do, so you took yourself away for a couple of weeks.
But it's brilliant because this is obviously, for us at least, quite a significant document or strategy that comes out, because to put it in context for those who are maybe either not in the UK or not involved in defence, previously under governments in the past, we've had other types of review similar to this, where it's not just covered defence, it's covered defence and security, or we then had an integrated review, and defence has been part of a broader picture, I suppose, whereas this one is really focused on defence, and it's really come out, I suppose, to place it in its context in the shadow of the war in Ukraine, and that's informed a lot of what's come through it. It's condensed a huge amount of material from contributions that have been made by people in industry, people in government, etc. So there's a lot in there to digest. I suppose it's also worth saying it is a strategy. It's not necessarily a plan. It's not necessarily describing how things are going to happen or play out in detail. But there's still a lot in there for us, I think, to draw upon, and sort of when we're coming from that defence tech space, to be thinking about in terms of, right, what does it mean for us, and what does it mean for the kind of companies that maybe you're looking at working with and helping them get into government contracts, etc., and the direction of travel, I suppose, for defence in the UK. And so it'd be great to maybe get some of your first impressions, I suppose, of having read it, and what do you think of it from the position you're in, and what do you see it, how do you see it maybe either affecting the sector, the private sector, or affecting the way we do defence overall in the UK?
Yeah, interesting question, Stuart. I mean, I think my overall impression of it, by the time I'd finished reading it, I felt like I'd been told off in several new and exciting ways. So,
I mean, yeah. How do you mean when you say told off? Like, well, unpack that a little bit, because
there is
key.
A lot of intent behind this review. You said that there are a lot of reviews, and it's easy to get terribly bored with review after review. But I think, simplistically, this is a review to rule all reviews. It's the Lord of the Rings of the review world. But I think a better perhaps way of describing it is, as government has described it, it's a root and branch review of the industry of defence. And it's pretty meaningful. So when I say, I feel like at the end of it I've been told off in several ways, it really has tried to get to the nub of some serious issues in defence. Now, that's not to undersell defence. Defence actually does some terribly difficult things under, even now, difficult resources against an impossible geopolitical argument. And to some extent, and I think this is really its purpose, in a way that starts to move it away from the concerns of everyday people, and that's got to change. And so, to me, actually, one of the biggest takeaways from the review is this idea of a whole of society approach. It's bringing defence back into the mainstream, and there's an undertone of, if you want peace, prepare for war. That's been said a lot, but I think this is more about bringing defence into the public consciousness. So it's not this sort of mysterious thing that happens elsewhere. If there was a layman, one were to pick up the Strategic Defence Review, sequester themselves for a couple of weeks and read through it, you might well find yourself sort of bored to tears with the defence environment. But I think that's just a victim of it trying to be so comprehensive, and I think it's actually done a pretty good job of doing that. Yes, it does read a bit like Orders.
Orders,
I think,
interesting.
Get on the bus, that this is happening, and there's some real.
When you say get on the bus, this is happening, you mean as in that shift towards preparing for peace but being ready for war?
Yes,
that's a big focus.
And also, I think, just a fundamental recognition of the need for change. So I think like the integrated review, for example, talked a lot about that, but it didn't, I would argue, give such explicit, meaningful objectives and, importantly, timeframes and milestones that may cynically be ambitious, but uncynically at least are there. There is a measurability to this review that hasn't existed before. It also, I'm told, has the highest statistical word count of the word innovation in any review to date.
I think I mentioned to you, but as I was reading through it, I kept thinking to myself, I wish I had £1 for every time they mentioned the word innovation. But I suspect if I did, then that £400 million budget they've allocated to innovation, there wouldn't be much left of it. So,
well, definitely, and you'd also have to reread the entire review to spot them, which might be an exercise in futility. But, it's an interesting one. The second most used word, I'm told, or seemed to be the case, was training, actually. And therein, you've got also this idea of this isn't just about the status quo. This is about really learning lessons. And I think, we've spoken before, of course, about the ominous shadow of the conflict in Ukraine. That is in the public consciousness. It's not the only thing, unfortunately, going on. And so there's a real need to constantly and continuously innovate and constantly and continuously train people for the realities of modern conflict, in the hope it doesn't happen. I mean, that's the key thing here is let's try and make sure it doesn't happen. The worst thing we can possibly do as a nation is sleepwalk into a global conflict totally unprepared. Is that likely to happen? Probably not. Again, let's not sort of undermine the brilliance of our defence and defence industries. They're exceptionally capable. But conflict leads to very, very rapid innovation. So we've got to get on top of that, and we've got to get on top of it fast.
Yeah, and I think you've neatly kind of spun through some of the key points that have come out of the SDR there, where you talk about that whole of society approach, innovation, training. I suppose for anyone who hasn't read it, who's not in your position of having,
I think that's the overwhelming majority.
Yeah, the overwhelming majority of people.
If you have read the Strategic Defence Review, get in touch.
Yeah.
We'd love to set up a book club. Until the next
Absolutely.
review next year.
Yeah. That would be a pretty small club.
It might just be me and you.
Yeah, probably would be me and you in the pub talking about defence. But I suppose the top line priorities that are expressed in the review: nuclear. Maintaining and developing the nuclear capability as a deterrent is mentioned as a top priority. Beyond that, there's kind of immediate priorities around, I suppose, like you said, touched on there, learning the lessons from war in Ukraine, etc., making defence intelligence more of a priority as well. The other aspect, I suppose, that is drawn out there in terms of reorganisation is moving into this sort of what they term the integrated force. Less almost kind of less emphasis, I suppose, on the different services and having their own capabilities, or hopefully, I mean, it was great. Obviously, I want to get your thoughts on this, but my hope is that it would mean that there will be less unhelpful competition over budgets and things like that, and capabilities, and more coordination and working together if that integration happens. But I suppose also the one thing there's a line I'm going to quote because it really stood out to me as being the one thing the one area that I really wanted to delve into with you, because I think it covers neatly a lot of the areas that you and I are interested in and focused on. And it came under this section of talking about procurement systems and how procurement happens. And it starts off by mentioning procurement systems and defence's relationship with industry have not materially changed since the Cold War. And it goes on to say, at the end of this paragraph, defence struggles to prioritise science and technology spending and exploit innovation for operational advantage. It is insufficiently prepared for the digital battlefield, lacks scale and resilience in data flows, and carries intolerable levels of cyber risk. And I know that was one that stuck with you as well. And
it's not great news, is it?
It's not. It doesn't. I mean, yeah. If anyone from Russia is listening to this, I just want to point out that we have an excellent defence force.
Oh,
and you definitely don't want to
yeah,
think about taking us on.
Don't even think about it.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I don't even think about it. But yeah, what's your take on when you sort of read something like that, and then you obviously in the context of the rest of the report, but.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Terry, there's one there, that straight away is exactly what we were talking about earlier. It feels like a bit of a telling off, and I suppose to an extent it is. I don't think it's intended to be just critical. It is intended to be constructively critical. And to do that, we need to get some pretty sharp sound bites, if nothing else, into political minds and into the political sphere, so something will be done about it. I mean, that's a direct statement there of intolerable cyber risk. It doesn't get much clearer.
Yeah.
Now, if we unpack that a little bit, what sits underneath that? Lack of investment in probably people, training, systems, maybe a lack of prioritisation. But also I think it's important to recognise that it's not necessarily because people are deliberately and willfully ignoring it. There are a lot of antiquated processes and systems that have been underinvested in, especially people. Right. It's been called the hollowing out of the armed forces.
They mention that quite a lot in the report.
Over a lot of time. And these are the stark realities. So I think one thing this Defence Review has really done is brought those stark realities to the fore. So this is actually what's happening. And I would argue actually it's removed some of the political capital around that by being so direct. It hasn't tried to dress too many of these things up. Again, intolerable cyber risk. It couldn't get much clearer than that. There are related issues. Replacing all this will cost a huge amount of money, but the cost of carrying on is probably far greater.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great point. And, the reason I sort of picked on that was, and not say some of the other, I suppose, the points that have come out of this that already have made headlines and things around the fact that we're going to be increasing production of munitions if the government is adopting all the recommendations. We already know that. We are yet to see how it's going to be implemented, etc. But they are talking about, at least within the SDR, increasing munitions production. They're talking about a 10x increase in lethality for the army, etc., which has obviously grabbed a lot of headlines. But
it has. We should also say that is qualified.
Yeah.
The 10% lethality, is supposed to be destructive and disruptive.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily about sort of kill count, but it is about strike impact, something being rendered inoperable.
Yeah, it's about having effect, really, isn't it?
Exactly. Being efficient in warfighting capability.
Yeah, but as you said, then thinking about cyber, thinking about the kind of things that I mentioned there in terms of technology and having that innovative capability. And we've mentioned already, innovation is mentioned a lot here. How do you feel, having read it, that, are you taking stuff away from this that makes you excited, as well as being told off? Are any elements of it exciting you in terms of thinking with the investment mindset, actually there's going to be opportunity here. There's going to be opportunity for the smaller, more innovative companies to come forward and support defence. And because I think one of the other aspects that struck me really was that there's a heavy emphasis in the SDR about how defence can be a driver of economic growth for the UK. So is that something you're looking at and thinking, actually, there's opportunity as well as us collectively, and I say collectively, private and public sector, I suppose, being told off and having the flaws of defence laid bare and open for everyone to inspect. But is there something there for you to get your teeth into?
There's certainly a lot of positivity, I think, to take from it. I mean, you mentioned opportunities in defence. They do exist already. I mean, maybe people would disagree with that, probably quite verbosely, but the opportunities do, to an extent, exist. Accessing them, however, is repeatedly running into a brick wall over and over and over again. And again, that is systems that just haven't kept pace. We talked about them earlier. Some of them haven't changed since the Cold War. There's a risk-averse mindset really that needs to shift into the new generation. People are used to putting out explicit specifications of things that they need to procure. The Defence Review recommends changing that to problem sets, areas where people might actually have some degree of ability even to innovate. I think also that there has been some discussion of perhaps an underinvestment or a lack of focus on earlier stage research and development and science and technology. I would argue that's not really the case, but it has happened to some extent behind closed doors. I think certainly in the last few years there's been a lot of focus on that, but it has been to the detriment of areas that we get really excited about, which is the commercial opportunity. That comes after the innovation. So the innovation's been had. Up until now, I would argue, you then could drop into what's being called the sort of valley of death for certainly for SMEs, which is you've built the thing, you've built it with a grant from government. These grants are still available now. Money is available to do these things, but you've built something. It is relevant to defence, otherwise I wouldn't have given you the grant money in the first place, but it does not necessarily equate to you will receive a contract at the end of it. So there has to be some commercial realities there. The first being, on the starter, if you are producing something that is only ever going to be bought by the UK MOD and you don't have a contract, it won't work. That's the simple reality. It needs to have some applicability.
You're
you're relying on a single contractual source there. There's a single contractual dependency, and the likelihood is you won't get it. If you have a comparable technology of, say, with 9 others, only one of those 10 is ultimately going to get the contract award for that area. So it's not really fair to beat government up about that. What I think is fair to beat them up about a little bit is what I call the no right door policy that seems to have sort of permeated government, hopefully up until now, and it's on the change. And if you look at some of the great work being done in countering cyber-enabled fraud, for example, a place like Australia and Singapore are actually particularly good at this. If you've been the victim of basically a cybercrime in which you've lost money, your personal money or business money, whomever you ring around the authorities, whether it's local police, a national service, whomever that you report that to, they, not you, will ensure that information and response gets routed to the right part of government in order to respond effectively. Now, that is the no wrong door policy. Here, it certainly seems there's this no right door policy. So you can go perhaps to one of the early innovation programs and say, hey, I've got a great idea. In fact, better than that, without even using some of that grant money, thank you, but we haven't needed it. We've built something. Yeah. And the response is, well, you're too late for us.
Too late or
too early in the precise sort of mechanics of what these things are designed to do.
Yeah.
So if you've already built something, it's available, it can be bought. We shouldn't be going to the innovation group.
Right.
That's for new innovations.
Yeah.
And straight away you can see this, I'm being sort of deliberately cynical. There are some great people working in these areas and really want to take a moment to just respect that. But I think this is really the issue. There are some really good people. There is not a really good system and process that supports those really good people in doing this. It's led by individuals sort of teaming up of their own volition rather than having that sort of underlying support and organisational structure that allows them to get things done.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's me being negative. Let's turn to the positives.
But just to touch on, though, one of the points you made there, which is that switch from specifications to problem sets.
Yes.
Because I think that's quite an important one, because certainly in my experience I've seen in the past where government, in defence in particular, they will put out heavily specific RFQs or, so requests for quotes or contract tenders or whatever it is, because they are looking for systems or they're looking for innovative capability. And I suppose the approach has been, well, we need to be as specific as possible so that we can hold whichever supplier wins this to that specification, and we also then know what we're getting for our money, and we can measure it and we can tick things off and say when we've got what we asked for, etc. And I think the problem there has always, there's been several problems there. One is that as much as that in theory is a good approach, in practice what tends to happen is there's a long delay often between something being announced or put out, a specification put out, and then somebody actually winning that. And the pace at which technology is changing now and the pace at which we need to innovate often means that by the time somebody's on contract to deliver that, it's not quite the right thing that defence needs. And so things have moved on and the scope needs to change and needs to shift, but they don't always have the flexibility to do that. They also don't encourage, I know they do certain things to try and elicit views from industry to say and find out what's out there and sort of say, okay, tell us about your capabilities, etc. But it often doesn't give, the way that the procurement then works, still it doesn't give them enough freedom to take the good ideas, I suppose, or to take the useful inputs from industry to be flexible in how they address a problem. Whereas now you're saying that switch to describing problem sets, I suppose that gives more flexibility and freedom to say to industry, this is what we're challenged by. How can you help us solve it? And actually, that's more likely to lead to positive outcomes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, for one, it starts to generate a two-way conversation. I mean, if you just put out a specification, you'll get something that precisely meets the specification. Now,
and then you're basically selecting on cost.
Well,
pretty
yes,
much, or
quite probably. You're selecting on people
yeah.
who's got the time to do things like read the Strategic Defence Review in full, but also fill these things out to the degree of accuracy that they're intended to. What's the point of doing that in the first place? The point is to protect use of public money, to make sure that our tax money is going to the right people in the right places for the right reasons, and it's generating the correct outcomes. Would you say in your personal experience that you think that to have been the case? I mean, I would take a pretty strong view of that and say, no, it seems unimaginable to have such a thing going on in government. And we've seen various reflections of that in other areas, not least of which through the pandemic.
Yeah, and I should add here, we're not being like politically partisan or whatever. This was the case under the previous government as much as it would be under the current
but this is the
government.
point about systems and process, which is what this review is supposed to address. So let's move forward to something that might actually work, certainly on the face of it, which is what is being presented here. And so for that innovation, yes, there's an idea of moving to problem sets. An example of a problem set might be there is no power and no communications in the UK for 24 hours.
Yeah.
Well, that's a problem, isn't it? It doesn't say,
Absolutely.
and we need to X, Y, and Z. It just says, here's the problem area. So one can fill that problem area with quite a few different innovations. Maybe there's an innovation about having some sort of communication that doesn't work with a power source. I mean, it used to be you'd go up the hill and light the fires. Maybe we have to do that again. But the point is there's room to manoeuvre. There's room to breathe and suggest innovations. There's something that's talked about quite a lot, which is the innovation cycle, which, as laid out in the review, says there's really three core principles at play here. The first is find it. Right? If you don't know this stuff exists, you're not going to buy it. And I actually think that's probably the area where most people find the cynicism in the approach at the moment. It's very hard to get onto a catalogue. Maybe you have to do some other sort of slightly odd approach. There's a consortium here. There's an SME registration portal over there. Yeah. That is something the review suggests doing. You say, okay, we've got the really early stage. We've got the grants for the actual innovation in the first place. When it's now in a format that can be bought, this is what the new UK Defence Innovation Centre is supposed to do. That's commercial innovation. That's accessing, that's finding. Next one, buy it. Find it, buy it. And buying in innovation that already exists, so we don't end up trying to innovate things. More than once, certainly, I have seen examples of requests for quotes, things like that, going out with a specific specification on what's required to innovate something new. So it's a framework for, or at least purports to be a framework for innovation, to read one of these things and go, well, hang on a minute. So the qualifying criteria are you have to be on 4 or 5 frameworks that open once every 5 years.
Yeah.
And also to look at it and go, I know at least 3 people that produce one of those already.
Yeah.
It exists, but nobody knows. And that's this sort of resistance to change. So, again, I talked about that telling off that sort of seems to be this undertone of the review. I think there's a few people being told off there to say, look, this isn't happening anymore. We've got to do this properly. We've got to do it quickly. The third one, by the way, is use it. So there's no point buying this stuff if you're not going to use it. But that's
a challenge in and of itself.
Well, exactly. So as obvious as that seems, it's quite hard to predict. I mean, look at the front lines of Ukraine. Yeah. It's quite hard to predict what comes next. That really is the innovation cycle at its most stark. People will live or die by the effectiveness of day-to-day innovation.
And the challenge there is with, I suppose, the bigger defence platforms and systems and things like that, the procurement to build to deployment cycle is so long. That in and of itself is going to take a long time. But now, I suppose what they're talking about here in terms of more innovative capabilities is things that can be more quickly found, bought and used and deployed. But I suppose coming back to that find issue, I feel like it's almost not for the want of trying. Like defence has tried to go out and find capabilities or offer ways in for people, but like you said, it can be really obscure. It can be really difficult, especially if you're building something that's dual use, so not specifically for defence.
Oh, definitely.
Purposes.
I mean, there can be a lack of imperative on the producers. Side of things, right?
And defence has got to go out and get it
I can sell it to a
utilities
utilities company, say, and that's relatively straightforward. Yeah. I mean, comparatively straightforward. Yeah. And I can try and sell it to defence. Now, as it stands, we're told in the review that anything over 20 million in contractual value can take up to 6.5 years to complete the contract. That's the contract, not the delivery of the platform or whatever else. Now, some of these are hugely complex, of course, and time should be taken to do it properly. But it shouldn't take 6.5 years. I mean, I think actually the average for most innovators, they probably say 2 to 3 years. and government will probably say 18 months because they're counting from the point they became aware of it themselves, whereas the SME is counting it from the point at which they first started trying to do it or to engage with government.
Yeah.
So 2 to 3 years, that's quite a long time. So when you're looking at investment coming into these areas, you've got to go, right, okay, well, the play here isn't let's do things as fast as possible, because that's not happening. It's just not happening. That's the reality. Can we try and do it faster? Yes. Government is aspiring here to do the innovation, the consumable element, to contract that within 3 months. Well, that's quite racy for government. 3 months,
incredible, absolutely incredible. Yeah,
if they achieve that really will make a big difference.
Yeah.
But there was also a point about understanding private capital coming into these sort of areas. There has to be that recognition that you need slightly more patient capital, in terms of you might need to give a company quite a long runway where there isn't going to be any really serious contractual signals for some time.
Yeah.
Now, we do a lot of work to say, okay, well, what else do we do? How do we underpin that? If you've produced, I don't know, if you're looking at a particular type of, let's say, propulsion system or something like that, have there been innovations along the way? Is there something like a heat sink in there which you could license to, say, Formula One or space exploration? And all of these things are sort of cross-dependent. That's that dual use element coming in. That's why it's so key. If you just rely on defence, that can be quite hard. Being in defence supply chain, also, you might be an SME producing, I don't know, screws or widgets for a large platform program. Well, you've got to wait that 6.5 years. But for the major suppliers to win the overarching headline contract, again, that should change.
Yeah, and have you? There's some talk, I suppose, of trying to change people's perception, or the perception of investors and banks and financial institutions, change their perception of investing in the defence sector.
Yeah.
Have you seen that starting to happen, or do you think actually the SDR is potentially going to really help with that? Because, again, it's the government putting more emphasis and focus on not just defence being about kind of the buying big bits of kit and stuff like that, but it's about that whole of society approach. It's about getting us as a country more ready for the kind of challenges we face internationally, etc. nowadays, and that sort of caveated promise, I suppose, to increase defence spending further down the line, of which they repeatedly say if finances allow, obviously. But
I think we could spend all day examining that.
Yeah. But do you think that'll give that kind of shift in mindset outside of defence?
I think some of that is already happening. And if you're just, there's nothing wrong also with being a company that isn't dual use, that is for defence and defence alone. But one should be clear. This is the point. One should be clear about what the money is being invested into if you're looking at private capital, and the return on that investment. How does that happen? When does it happen? Yeah. What are the other factors that come in? There's a term we use quite often in the space, particularly in the venture space, but actually in the commercial space in general too, which is what's the value proposition. If you're selling something, you want to sell it on its value, not its features. It's got 10 widgets and 144 pages in the case of the Strategic Defence Review. I think that's right.
Yeah, it was.
Do fact check me on that.
No, I can confirm that.
So we talk about a value proposition. What happens at the end? What's that? There's an emotive thing to that. So there's a bit of psychology going in there about how the sales process works. But what's the value proposition of what you're doing? Maybe it's saving lives. Maybe it's protecting critical systems. But that's the value proposition. And when we're looking at defence, there now seems to be this idea. I think it's burgeoning. It's not quite out in the public consciousness yet, but it's representing defence correctly, I would argue, to say what is defence's values proposition? What is defence actually about? Is it about just fighting people and duffing them up and having a jolly good time overseas in crazy places and shooting things?
Yeah.
No, it's literally about protecting our values, our way of life. They couldn't be more different than some of our adversaries.
Yeah.
And the only way we get to protect them is to fight for them, or be willing to fight for them if that becomes necessary. And that's that whole of society thing, I think. It's recognising that, if you're at a dinner party or something like that, people used to mutter under their breath, "Oh, work in defence," but partly because they're worried about the security implications. But if they're really worried, they wouldn't have said it at all. But people have been a bit embarrassed. The rightful push of particularly liberal values to make sure people are fairly and fairly represented to remove biases in certain systems where they exist, and to make sure there aren't any, in other areas. Great stuff, but none of that happens. None of that happens if we don't literally fight for those same democratic values, even basic things like the right to self-determination.
Right.
So you've really got to bring everybody on board with that. You can't just say, well, these guys are going to fight, but don't worry about it. Go back to whatever you're doing on your iPhone. That has to come together a little bit and sort of, at least in recognition, and go, actually, that's quite important. And I think that is where what's been called, I think, the peace dividend, from the we would say the end of the Cold War, but I think probably Russia would have a different view of that. I mean, I think Russia, to some extent, is meaningfully at war with the UK already.
Yeah.
It might not be in sort of direct kinetic conflict, but it is happening.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily in the sort of public mind, and it's important. We don't want to scaremonger here, right? There are big risks, but it's a difficult thing to get your head around defence if you've never experienced it before. And if you read the SDR in its entirety, it will be even harder still to get your head around what's going on.
True. I mean, I suppose they do name the kind of usual suspects in terms of adversaries and competitors that we face. I think what's less explicit in there is that, yes, Russia is an adversary, and we are, like you said, we are potentially fighting against them right now in that kind of sub-threshold space, which is the way they've termed it.
Yes.
in the review. That, though, kind of doesn't always place it in its context of, well, actually, we are out and defending our values against Russia. Russia's not on its own, though.
Correct.
Russia still has allies.
Yes, it does.
And so this is not just a competition between us and one other country or two or three other countries. There's a broader, to your point about capturing that mindset shift, I suppose, among the public of, actually, yeah, we are trying to defend our values, and these values are important because this is what allows us to live the lives that we enjoy and what makes people want to come to this country and all the rest of it. But that's an international thing. That's not just us. And actually, I suppose they allude to that in the review in the sense of there's a big emphasis on NATO first.
Yes.
We are part of NATO, and we will support that. Not exclusively going to operate with NATO.
NATO first, but not NATO only.
Not NATO only. That's how.
That's how we're describing it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. But that's it is. We are part of that global competition that is going on right now, and it'd be great to get your take on that kind of sub-threshold piece and how that plays out, or how that's currently playing out, I suppose, and especially in the context of another element of the review, which is dedicating new, I suppose, emphasis to cyber EM within defence, cyber and electromagnetic. So yeah, great to get your thoughts on that particular area of the review, I suppose.
No, certainly. I mean, this is the sort of stuff that very quickly does come into, the public sphere. That there's a measurable and demonstrable impact of things that happen in the cyberspace. So we looked at the recent disruptions, for example, on M&S as a retailer. Okay, that's, we think, non-state, but the implication is there.
Yeah.
Now, when you have potential conflicts arising, these sub-threshold threats are really doing everything. The point is, the threshold is one for declaration of war. So our adversaries play this game very well. Cyber is the only domain, cyber and EM is the only domain that is contested every single day in a meaningful way. So yes, there are other domains that are protected and so on and so forth. But cyber, this is going all the time, specifically sub-threshold. So it's not tipping over. Now, part of that sub-threshold challenge is obfuscation. So our adversaries can pretend to be somebody else, or it can be difficult to say with absolute certainty. And bear in mind here, we're talking about declaration of war. It's a pretty serious thing. Yeah. So you want to be absolutely sure that the country you're saying is behind something actually did it. Yeah. And you also want to be absolutely sure that it was of a sufficient threshold to lead you to want to declare war in the first place. Maybe interfering with people shopping for a few days probably isn't at that threshold. Well, our adversaries know that, so they'll keep doing that. And I think these things we can expect to see more of. Once you have crossed that line, conventional warfare comes into play. Things no longer need to be cyber attacked. They might be hit with conventional weapons. But yeah, sub-threshold is where things are playing out right now. And we see all those sort of other actors come together. There's also a point about access to what we'd call low-end capability, so a similar sort of thing. The obvious one is first-person view drones, and we've seen some,
seen a lot
really
of that,
crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Operation Spiderweb, really, really clever operation. For those that don't know, that is the simple version is that Ukraine basically loaded a load of drones, explosive-laden drones, onto shipping containers hidden within a concealed compartment on the top, drove those into Russia so they weren't too far away from target and wouldn't be detected, and then at a predefined sort of time and space, opened those concealed compartments. The drones went on to destroy Russian planes and Russian bombers. So there's an immediate impact there of something that's actually quite low cost and we would say low-end capability. It's not especially advanced. The operation is very smart, but the capability underpinning it, relatively low end. Also a secondary effect, actually, we talk about sub-threshold activity. If the secondary effect was the sole effect, that would probably be a sub-threshold activity. The secondary effect is try driving a cargo truck into Russia right now. So immediately logistics is jammed down. All of the border points, everyone's searching for what if there's more of these things in concealed compartments. So everything's got to be searched. Massive impact there on logistics.
That's a great example, really great example of the kind of stuff that we might see more of, I suppose.
Absolutely. So if there is talk, this is in the SDR as well, that there is a lot of talk around the resurgence of some global terrorist groups. There is also specific note that they are starting to gain capabilities they haven't had until this point in time. That includes things like cyber capabilities. They're pretty rudimentary. By the sound of it, that's changed quite substantially. But these low-end capabilities, can a terrorist get a first-person view drone? Yeah, you could buy one now on Amazon. You can have them deliver it here. Other retailers are available. But these things are very accessible. That comes with a recognition that, there's a real potential for there to be a huge number of complex actors. What's described, again, this whole of society, it's a generational challenge that almost anybody can get access now to some pretty punchy capability and use it. Well, that's a problem. There's also a real potential for escalation, as it's described in the SDR, a potential for escalation. Yeah, of course there is. Something that might in the past have relied on large platforms, perhaps a carrier group or something being moved into position. That's not the speediest thing in the world. I mean, they're pretty fast, agile, platforms as they go, but it takes a bit of time to sail a carrier group from one part of the globe to another. In that time, diplomacy can come in. Other warnings can happen. Other platforms can be moved around. Defence and offensive capabilities can be readjusted. There can be lobbying. There can be pressure on allies to do other things. There is time for statecraft to come in and prevent conflict. If you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of disposable munitions readily available, that time window is pretty small. You can have a pretty serious impact
so quickly,
very fast. Yeah, exactly. And the SDR recognises this too, and of course we keep sort of coming back to what it says, but that is rather the point. Is they've gone through all of this, the sort of same process of conversation we're having now in intricate detail. Something they have said, this is intended to apply specifically to land forces, but there's an overall sort of relevance, which is 20-40-40, which is the proportion of sort of allocation of capability. So 20% on crewed large platforms. It might be a tank, something like that. 40% on reusable things. So that could be fixed-wing drones, for example, in an intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance mission. That's something, it's a larger, more expensive drone. It's still a drone. It's still an autonomous capability. But you can use it more than once. And then this is an interesting area. It's one we see prior to this this impending acceptability of defence again, but what people have often called single-use, one-way disposable effectors. which in layman's terms, that might be a missile or a,
Yeah.
or a bomb. But you can see straight away there's a real thing about language there, right?
Yeah.
Sort of trying to hide what you're doing. But consumable things like artillery shells or those smaller low-end drones, for example.
Say kamikaze drones, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So straight away there you can see, people say, we don't need tanks anymore, we just need drones. No, the reality is you need a mixture of these things, and the Strategic Defence Review recommends that the mixture should be 20%, 40%, and 40% accordingly.
Thoughts? Do you think they've got it right in terms of that balance? I mean, I know it's hard to say.
It's a bit too precise, isn't it? But for a defence review, then that probably seems about right. I think General Sir Patrick Sanders once famously said, "You can't cyber your way across a river." Well, he's right. Now, what he's not doing is underselling the UK's fantastic operational cyber capabilities and cyber security capabilities. They're great. They're some of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. They've had to be.
Yeah.
But they are very good. There's a point about the reason they're so good is because they're being tested every day. And again, we look at the SDR and it is about that readiness and response. So the proportion feels right, but you do need all of these things. We can't simply look at Ukraine and go, well, that's exactly how the next conflict will happen.
Yeah.
It will change as drones become more and more available and relevant, and drone defeat technology counters it. We've seen these lessons before, so there'll be something else, and that really is the nature of defence, is to keep ahead with innovation, keep ahead of your adversary, to have the ability to be lethal when you need it, and the ability to defend against that same lethality on behalf of one's foe. Yeah.
Is there anything that you think was missing from the SDR that you would have liked to have seen in, anything that in particular relates to areas you're specifically involved in or looking at, or that you think where they've talked about specific capabilities, whether it's that 20-40-40 mix, specific capabilities defence needs that it hasn't got, or that they need to develop, etc. Yeah, was there anything else in there that you think actually they kind of missed something, or they could have added this in?
Yeah, I think there's a few areas where they've been quite detailed, and there's a few areas where perhaps the detail is sort of subtly lacking. Right. So it sort of says, well, obviously you should establish a new command that does this, but it doesn't sort of say how.
Got it. Yeah.
And that's,
I suppose that's the luxury of being a strategy document rather than
to some
a
extent
plan.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It is a strategy, not a plan. But I think in some places it slightly underestimates what's required to do that, or perhaps they've been very careful not to be drawn on these areas, on purpose. It should specifically include certain things. Maybe that would be helpful. I think they've been very careful not to overcommit, but they've certainly given some very specific views of, for example, the integrated force. They've got this idea of the digital warfighter, the digital web being the sort of point where all these things interact.
That digital web sounded interesting.
How does this interface with everything else?
Yeah.
So, defence isn't a completely isolated government department that never talks to anyone. Well, I suppose it depends who you ask. But, it must work with other areas, including the UK intelligence community. It's mentioned a few times in the review. There's certainly been some political capital out of saying, we're not doing an uplift to 2.5%, it's 2.6%. Actually, what happened, there's a sort of nuance of language there that seems to have said, we're including security now, so there wasn't any additional money. They just sort of lumped the intelligence services budget together with the defence budget to make that announcement. There's the sort of cynical part again. But yes, there is rightly a point of cut-off in the review where it doesn't extend its brief, and again that's probably correct, but it would have been nice to see recognition of where that was. So there's these sort of hints towards it, and particularly around the intelligence community, it says things like defence intelligence must work better with the UK intelligence community. Yeah. Okay, fine, and a delicate area we don't want to be discussing in a public document. But one of the recommendations, I would argue one of the biggest sort of U-turns recommended in defence policy for decades, it says, well, why don't we rebrand UK Defence Intelligence to be Military Intelligence Services? Well, MI5 is Military Intelligence Division. These things came out of military intelligence in a war-fighting situation in the first place. Yeah. So we really have gone sort of completely full circle, and that was, I found that slightly maddening. But in terms of what was missing, it doesn't seem to state, and this is where the intersection is, where perhaps another review might pick up something quite relevant. The intolerable cyber risk we talked about earlier. National cyber strategy is, undergoing review at the moment. It's under constant review, but there's some specific reviews coming out about that too. There's a danger that everyone goes, right, we've got the SDR, shut us up, let's go and try and deliver to these probably slightly impossible milestones. Okay, we've been asked for the moon on a stick, but perhaps we can at least design a stick. Let's go away and get busy. Well, if we do that, all we're going to do is really precipitate the need for a further integrated defence review, 3 to 5 years from now. So, it would have been useful to see, actually, there is one, it does talk about in healthcare, about noting the need to be more interoperable with the NHS as well. So there are little hints towards that. But, I felt there could have been some more work done to sort of say, and this is where we recommend you draw the line, and another department or another area of government picks things up.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think you've spun through pretty much everything that are all the main points in the SDR, and I think it's like you've said, it's a really meaningful document, and it's come out at a time when perhaps the national conversation around defence has to change, and we've got to be able to bring more people into this conversation and say, actually, there is a huge challenge here, and we need to be ready for it collectively. And it's not just on the Ministry of Defence, and it's not just on everyone working in defence, whether it's private or public sector, to worry about it, but it's for the whole country. And in some quarters, people are suggesting that we're already sliding into World War III. I would argue we're not there yet. There isn't a tier one nation that's fighting against another tier one nation. But what's your take on when we might hit the next global world war, let's say?
Yeah, interesting one. I mean, difficult to be pinned down with precision, but I think if you look at the coalescence of certain events, that there is a degree of likelihood we'll be in a meaningful global conflict by mid-2027. If not then mid-2029 has also been talked about. The reference in the SDR, it talks about this is all about preparedness and readiness to fight with a peer state.
Exactly.
So this is no longer about disparate regional conflicts. This is about fighting a peer state. That language is quite precise. Actually, that's a peer state is someone with similar capabilities to our own. Size is sort of relevant capability. Size is irrelevant. Capability, definitely is. So there is a danger of that. There have been some less specific things and more specific things in the sort of public sphere. Of the less specific, there's a general move. It's not just us getting ready for a potential global conflict. Our adversaries are too. There are a few things that start to coalesce. I think I'm right in saying the US midterms could be an interesting sort of point geopolitically for something else to happen. But the most explicit statement of intent has been from China, where Xi Jinping has said explicitly, I want the Chinese armed forces to be ready to retake Taiwan by force if necessary by mid-2027. I mean, it doesn't get more specific than that. Whether or not that actually proceeds, we shall see, and that's rather the sort of point underpinning these reviews and this intent is to get ready fast so that hopefully we don't have to enter that conflict. Final thought on that is a global war isn't something everyone just agrees to and off we go, let's have a dust up at 3:00. A global war unfortunately happens because a series of sort of interdependent or interrelated regional conflicts mass into a larger global conflict. And if we don't get a grip, not just of our defence programmes, but also, foreign policy, this whole sort of NATO first does not mean NATO only. That's really important. Let's make sure we're identifying and supporting our global partners as part of this. So hopefully we can avoid that. That's stark reality. Yeah, I think the international partnerships and alliances is a huge aspect of what has come through in the SDR. Interoperability being, the way that it's described, and I think we'll see a lot more of that in the future. Yeah, definitely. Wars can't be fought alone if they have to be fought. There's also a school of thought that says, the armed forces go to war, but it's civilians, it's nations that win them. Without an underpinning public support, these things arguably are fruitless and pointless. So, again, that whole of society message throughout the review is really key here. If we are going to go to war, it better be for the right reasons.
It's been really interesting to get your views and your take on it, Matt.
Well, I'm happy to give them to as you probably noticed. No, I do think it is interesting. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. I mean, as a sort of passing thought, that this whole of society thing, I really do actually quite passionately believe in that. It's the reason why we're so interested in helping companies in this area. But there's a use of the term that says, look, defence can no longer be contracted out to our armed forces. We can't just go, oh, well, they're doing that over there, let's forget about it. That's what's got to fundamentally change. People need to recognise this as part of society and not separate from it. And I think that's actually a really good message to get behind, because everything falls into that. The innovation, yes, that we're particularly excited about, but also really important areas like forces accommodation, which is, I don't know if you've seen some of these places, but they're absolutely awful. I mean, there's a joke in some of them, air conditioning is the holes in the sheets. well, that's not right, is it? That's just not right. These people are putting their lives on the line for our country, and the likelihood of them having to do that has gone up. So, for goodness sake, let's back them up in these areas.
It's been bad for a long time, and one thing I would say about it is that the gap between the level of, or the standard of living in civilian life has grown, or the gap between the standard of living civilian life versus the standard of living in military accommodation has grown massively.
Yes.
And that creates problems in the challenge you have when it comes to recruitment. People come in and they're like, well, what the hell is this? And it's not just the accommodation, it's actually about things like technology. People will come into areas of government and they'll be like, hang on, what is this machine you're giving me, and why can't I do all the things I can do outside of government?
Yeah, or you can't bring your phone in.
You can't bring your phone in.
I mean, there's a good reason behind that.
There is,
that is.
But there is that mismatch of expectations, which becomes a recruitment challenge. But the living situation, is massively. I suppose, in some ways, it's calamitous for defence, not just recruiting people, but retaining them.
Yeah, and I would say it's somewhat symptomatic as well of, there you can point to something and go, well, this is representative of the degree of regard in which we're held by central government. Yeah. Even if it's not, even if that's not the case, it certainly would be held to that sort of standard. So, it's certainly a great place to start. These things all cost money. There's a difficulty to doing that.
Salaries and recruitment are an issue. If you're trying to bring in technical capability, because it's all very well and good saying let's get innovative capability in. You can go out to the most fantastic technology firms and buy in data or software or hardware or whatever it might be. You still need a similar level of expertise and capability in-house to be able to deploy that and make use of it.
A really good point. There is some subtle actually, language around that too. It talks about innovation isn't just about sort of peacekeeping and warfighting. There's innovation to be done in the administrative functions of defence to free up time, resource and money. There's innovations in how you might set up housing to make it more affordable, but also a degree nicer and all of these things. So yes, this is very, very much a systematic review has been suggested, and government said it will take it on. Time will be the judge, as with all things.
Yeah. And sadly, we're up against time. Because, Matt, I know you and I could probably talk about this all day, but...
Well, careful, we might hold you to that.
Yes. By the time we've finished dissecting it, it will be time to probably conduct the next review. Thanks so much for giving us your time and your thoughts and expertise on this. I'm sure it's an area we're going to hear a lot more about in the coming weeks and months.
I think so too. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be involved.
I think my one big takeaway from this conversation with Matt is the signal that comes out of the SDR that we are now having to gear up defence to be ready for war in a way that we haven't done for a very long time. And that doesn't just involve defence, it doesn't just involve the MOD, it doesn't just involve defence industry, it involves the whole of society, as it mentions in the review. And that's going to involve a mindset shift. It's going to involve us all making defence more of a national conversation, and with that, international affairs. The defence of the UK doesn't happen in a vacuum. We've got to understand more closely and perhaps with more nuance what is going on elsewhere in terms of the kind of threats we face, and also some of the choices we make around how we use technology in the future, and how that technology impacts us not just from a defence and security perspective, but also in day-to-day life. Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Atreides, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at atreides.io.